everyone. This is Angela at beginninggenealogist.com. How are you doing? Today I want to talk about the census, and I want us to take a look very closely at some of the details that are captured on the census records. I'm going to focus on the years 1930, 1920, 1910, and 1900. On another video, I will focus on earlier years. But I want to ask you if you've really looked at all of the details that you can find. On some census years, you can learn a lot about women in terms of how many children they had. Prior to that particular census year, there may be other children on that particular year that you're looking at that had moved out of the house. Perhaps some had died that you don't know their names, and perhaps can get a clue on where to find those names as well. Their information, all kinds of wonderful information about the industries in which people worked in the community. In many places in rural communities, obviously farming was the industry, but sometimes you'll be surprised. Some people may have worked at a lumber mill or at a logging camp, or maybe they worked as miners. And in many cases you can learn a lot, even about ancestors perhaps that you did not know were self-employed as well. Wonderful pieces of information that you can glean just by looking at the details. So today we're going to look very closely at those individual census years and pay attention to the differences, because from year to year, from one census year to another, not all of the same information was captured, and it is important to be able to know what the differences were. So join me, I'm going to go off camera, and we're going to put some documents on camera. So let's take a look, okay?
So let's take a close look at the various census years from 1930 to 1900. 1930 was the 15th census of the United States. It's been taken every 10 years beginning in 1790. To protect the privacy of living people, information in the census is sealed from the public for 72 years. 1930 was released in 2002, and 1940 is scheduled to be released in 2012. When you identify the names of your ancestors on a record, it's important to capture all data, including the state and county, the township or incorporated place, and in larger cities, the ward, and of course, the enumeration district and the page on which the family is found. I recommend that you obtain some blank census forms so that you can read more closely and more easily what the various pieces of data that were collected were. These can be obtained online easily on websites such as Ancestry.com, or quite easily from archives.gov. In 1930, questions were asked, of course, about the individuals, but also about the home, and not just the people who lived in the home. By rotating the form, we can see more closely some of the data that was collected. If the home was rented or owned, that is captured. The value of the home or the rent being paid was also collected. And the question was asked whether or not the home had a radio. Well, this tells you if the family had electricity where they lived. And of course, the additional personal data is always there. If your ancestors were immigrants to America, information about their mother tongue was recorded, and the year in which they immigrated to this country is also captured. And importantly, if you had ever wondered whether an ancestor had served in the military, that information was recorded as well. This can be very useful when looking at the 1930 census to determine whether or not there was an ancestor who may have served, for example, in World War I. 1920 is an interesting year when the 14th federal census was conducted. There's some useful information collected about the location of the family abode. I have often seen on some of the census forms the street where the family lived often being written on the side in the margin. And of course, it's useful to note that the house number on that particular street is also recorded. The standard personal information is there, including color, race, age, and marital status. Place of birth, of course, is recorded as it is in most census years. Information about employment is also collected in the 1920 census, not just occupation, but the industry in which an ancestor worked. And also, it's a great way to find out if you have an ancestor who was self-employed. That was also noted on the 1920 census form. I enjoy looking at the 1910 federal census, the 13th federal census. For women, information about the number of children that she's given birth to is collected. In terms of how many live births is asked of women of all childbearing years, and secondly, how many were still living. For men, there is a question that does not appear in previous census years. There are many boxes on the far right of that 1910 census form, including questions about physical disabilities. However, third box from the right, there's a question about military history. I like that question primarily because it's a great way to find out if you had an ancestor who served in the Civil War, whether they were Union, Confederate, soldier, or sailor. This is very useful. It's also useful, particularly if you study the community where your ancestors lived. It's a good idea to run your hand down that particular column and take note if there are ancestors or neighbors of your ancestors who are also veterans from the Civil War. 1900 census was the 12th federal census. It's a favorite year for many because it too asks questions about women, about the number of children that they had had and how many were still living. But the special information that I like in 1900 was the fact that the month and the year of birth is asked. Now, of course, it is important to remember that ages should always be considered estimates. But for many researchers, particularly those who are researching individuals who had once been enslaved, it's a good time pointer to a possible year of birth. These close-ups of the census years from 1930 to 1900 are provided to illustrate simply that it is important to look at all of the categories and all of the boxes that are provided on the census forms. You can learn a lot about your ancestors, their lifestyle, the location of their homes, the families, the numbers of children born, and information about their early years by simply paying attention to all of those details. I hope you found these images helpful.
Well, I hope you found that information useful and hope that you will consider zooming in on those boxes far to the right and paying attention to what is really there. And join me next time. We will be looking at some other census years in future videos as well. Anyway, thanks for your time this time, and I'll see you next video. Bye-bye.